The small diner, on the corner of Broad Street and Magnolia Avenue, wasn't much to look at, but for Latoya, it was her second home. The flickering neon sign outside that read, "Marcy's Diner," might have turned away passers-by, but inside the smell of sizzling bacon and fresh coffee greeted anyone who entered. Latoya had been working here for 7 years, and while the pay wasn't great, she took pride in treating every customer like family. Latoya was known for her warm smile and her uncanny ability to sense when someone was having a rough day. She worked the morning shifts, often arriving before sunrise to prep for the breakfast rush. Her boss, Mr. Harper, ran the diner with a strict hand, constantly reminding the staff to stick to the basics and avoid wasting time on unnecessary niceties. To him, time was money, and every second Latoya spent chatting with customers or offering extra napkins felt like a wasted opportunity. It was a Thursday morning, just after the morning rush had died down. Latoya had barely finished refilling the coffee pots when a man walked in. He wasn't the diner's usual type of customer. No blue-collar uniform, no familiar face from the neighborhood. He was dressed in a sharp, albeit wrinkled suit, his tie slightly askew. He looked out of place, but more than that, he looked lost. Latoya watched him as he hesitated near the door. His eyes darted around the room before settling on a booth in the corner. He moved slowly, as if the weight of the world was on his shoulders. Something about his demeanor struck her. She grabbed a menu and approached his table. "Good morning, sir," she said warmly, placing the menu in front of him. "Can I get you started with some coffee?" The man glanced up at her, his face tired and drawn. "Just water, please," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Latoya nodded and returned a moment later with a glass of water. "You take your time," she said softly. "If you need anything, just let me know." As she walked back to the counter, she caught Mr. Harper glaring at her. "Latoya," he said sharply, his voice low but firm, "we don't have time to cater to loiterers. If he's not ordering, he needs to leave." Her stomach tightened. She hated how Mr. Harper always seemed to judge people based on appearances. "He's just deciding," she said evenly, keeping her voice calm. "You've got tables to clean." Mr. Harper snapped, "Focus on paying customers." Latoya turned away, biting her tongue. She hated confrontation, but something about the man's quiet demeanor made her feel like she couldn't ignore him. She knew what it was like to feel invisible, to have people look right through you. She wasn't about to do that to him. Over the next few minutes, she found small ways to offer kindness. She refilled his water without being asked. When she saw him fidgeting with his tie, she brought him a napkin and said, "You look like you've had a rough morning. Let me know if I can get you something warm." The man gave her a faint smile, and for a moment, she thought she saw a glimmer of gratitude in his eyes. He eventually ordered a small breakfast, just toast and scrambled eggs, and ate in silence. Latoya didn't pry, but she kept an eye on him, ready to help if he needed it. When he finished, he stood and reached into his pocket, but his hand came up empty. His face flushed with embarrassment as he muttered, I seem to have forgotten my wallet." Before Mr. Harper could notice, Latoya stepped in. "It's okay," she said quickly, "I've got this one." The man's eyes widened. "I can't let you." "It's just eggs and toast," she said with a shrug, trying to make it sound casual. "Consider it a kindness." He stared at her for a long moment, as if searching for the right words. Finally, he said, "Thank you truly." Latoya nodded and smiled, brushing it off like it was no big deal. But as the man left the diner, she felt Mr. Harper's eyes boring into her. She knew she was in trouble. "Latoya," he said, his tone cold, "my office now." Latoya followed Mr. Harper into his cramped office at the back of the diner. The walls were lined with faded photographs and shelves crammed with old invoices. The room smelled faintly of stale coffee and frustration, a fitting backdrop for what Latoya knew was coming. Mr. Harper didn't waste time. "What were you thinking, giving that man a free meal?" he demanded, his voice sharp enough to cut through the hum of the diner. "Outside, you know. We can't afford to hand out charity here." Latoya stood her ground, folding her arms across her chest. "He looked like he needed help." She said evenly, "It wasn't a big deal." "Not a big deal." Mr. Harper's face turned red. "Do you think this place runs on good intentions? You're here to work, not play savior." Her cheeks flushed with anger, but she kept her voice steady. "I don't see how a plate of eggs and toast is going to bankrupt the diner." "That's not the point," Mr. Harper snapped, slamming his hand down on the desk. "You undermine me in front of a customer, and now you're arguing with me. This isn't your personal charity operation, Latoya. If you can't follow the rules, maybe you don't belong here." The words hung in the air like a cloud of smoke, suffocating and inescapable. Latoya stared at him, her heart pounding. She thought about the years she'd spent working at the diner, long hours on her feet, dealing with difficult customers, cleaning up messes without complaint. All of it felt meaningless in this moment. "Fine," she said quietly, swallowing the lump in her throat. "If that's how you feel, I'll go." Mr. Harper blinked, clearly not expecting her to call his bluff. "You're fired," he said. After a pause, his voice lower now, but no less firm. "Pack up your things and leave. You can pick up your final paycheck at the end of the week." Latoya nodded, refusing to let him see the tears welling up in her eyes. She turned and walked out of the office, her head held high. The other staff watched her in stunned silence as she grabbed her bag and coat. She didn't say goodbye, she didn't need to. As she stepped outside into the chilly morning air, the reality of what had just happened began to sink in. She'd lost her job over a simple act of kindness. She felt a mixture of anger and sadness, but beneath it all was a quiet sense of resolve. She'd done what she believed was right, and no one could take that away from her. The walk home was long and quiet. Latoya lived in a small apartment above a laundromat. A few blocks away, the place was modest but clean, with just enough room for her and her tabby cat, Smokey. As she climbed the stairs to her front door, her legs felt heavier with each step inside. Smokey greeted her with a soft meow, weaving between her legs as she kicked off her shoes. Latoya sank onto the couch, her head in her hands. She replayed the morning in her mind, second-guessing herself at every turn. Had she made the right choice? Could she have handled things differently? The doubts gnawed at her, but deep down, she knew she couldn't have ignored the man's obvious need for help. That night, she lay awake in bed staring at the ceiling. Bills piled up in her mind, each one demanding an answer. She didn't have rent was due in 2 weeks, and she didn't have a backup plan. Still, something in her heart told her that this wasn't the end of her story. It couldn't be the next day. She woke up early, determined to figure out her next steps. But just as she was pouring herself a cup of coffee, there was a knock at the door. She froze, her heart skipping a beat. She wasn't expecting anyone. Setting her mug down, she walked to the door and opened it cautiously. Her breath caught in her throat when she saw who was standing there. It was him, the man from the diner. Only now he didn't look lost or disheveled. He stood tall, his suit crisp and his expression calm but serious. In his hand was a small envelope. "Good morning," he said, his voice warm and steady. "I owe you an explanation, I owe you." Latoya's first instinct was to close the door. It wasn't that she was angry at the man. Far from it, but the shock of seeing him again so soon made her hesitate still. There was something in his eyes, a quiet sincerity that made her pause. "May I come in?" he asked, holding the envelope up as if it were a peace offering. Latoya glanced at the envelope, then back at him finally. She stepped aside. "Sure," she said cautiously, "but I hope you're not here to apologize for what happened. That wasn't your fault." The man stepped into her modest apartment, taking in the sparse but tidy living space. Smokey, ever the curious cat, padded over to inspect the visitor. The man crouched slightly, offering his hand. "Friendly little guy," he said with a small smile. Latoya folded her arms, watching him carefully. Look, I don't mean to be rude, but why are you here? The man straightened up, his smile fading first. Let me introduce myself properly. My name is Jonathan Reeves, he said, and before I explain, I need you to know something. What you did yesterday meant more to me than you can imagine. Latoya frowned, unsure how to respond. I just brought you some eggs and toast, she said, her tone guarded. It wasn't anything special. That's where you're wrong. Jonathan replied, you treated me like a human being. When I felt like nothing, do you know how rare that is? Latoya shook her head, still unsure what to make of this conversation. What are you talking about? Jonathan took a deep breath and looked her in the eye. Yesterday, I wasn't just some random guy walking into a diner. I was testing something, an experiment. If you will, an experiment. Latoya repeated, her voice tinged with disbelief. What kind of experiment? I'm a businessman, Jonathan explained. I own several companies across the country, but recently I've been looking for something different. People keep telling me how disconnected I've become, how out of touch I am with the struggles of everyday life. So I decided to see for myself. I left my wallet at home, dressed down, and visited places like your diner to observe how people treat someone they think has nothing to offer. Latoya's eyes widened. So you're saying you were pretending? Jonathan nodded. I wanted to find someone genuine, someone who would help without expecting anything in return. And you, Latoya, you were that person. Her stomach churned with a mix of emotions. She didn't know whether to feel flattered or furious. So what, this was all just some kind of game to you? Not at all, Jonathan said quickly. It was never about tricking anyone. It was about finding people who still believe in kindness, even when there's no reward in sight. And you, he paused, reaching into the envelope. You gave me hope. He handed her the envelope, and Latoya hesitated before taking it. Inside was a check, a number so large that her breath caught in her throat. Her hands trembled as she looked back at him. This can't be real, she whispered. It is, Jonathan said softly. It's not just a thank you. It's an investment in you. I believe you have something special, and I want to help you use it. Latoya stared at the check, her mind racing. Part of her wanted to reject it outright. She wasn't the type to take handouts. But another part of her, the part that had spent the previous night worrying about rent and bills, knew this was a lifeline she couldn't ignore. I don't know what to say, she finally admitted. Say yes, Jonathan replied. Let me help you build something better for yourself. You deserve it. Latoya sat down on the couch, her hands gripping the check as if it might disappear. She couldn't stop staring at the number. It was more money than she'd ever imagined. Holding in her life, Smokey jumped up beside her, oblivious to the tension in the room, and nuzzled against her arm. It was a small comfort in the whirlwind of emotions flooding her mind. Jonathan took a seat across from her, his expression calm but earnest. I know this is a lot to take in, he said gently, and I don't expect you to make any decisions right now, but I want you to know why I'm doing this. Latoya raised her eyes to meet his, still struggling to process everything. Why me, she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. There are so many people out there who need help. More than I do. Jonathan leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. Because you didn't see me as a problem to be solved. You didn't look at me like I was beneath you. You just helped, no questions, no judgment, just kindness. That's rare, Latoya, and it's something the world needs more of. His words hit her like a wave, washing over the doubts that had been building. In her mind, she thought about her years at the diner, the countless times she'd stayed late to help a coworker or slipped a few dollars into the tip jar of a struggling busboy. None of it had ever felt like a big deal to her. It was just who she was. But now, sitting across from Jonathan, she realized that her small acts of kindness had ripples she couldn't have foreseen. What is it you want me to do? She asked finally, her voice steadier now. Jonathan smiled, relieved that she was open to hearing him out. "That's up to you," he said. "This isn't a loan or a contract. It's a gift, but if you are willing, I'd like to help you figure out how to use it in a way that makes a difference." Latoya blinked, caught off guard by his sincerity. "You really mean that?" "I do," he said firmly, "but I have one suggestion. Something to think about. Have you ever thought about starting your own business?" Her laugh was short and hollow. "Me, a business? I don't even know where to start." "That's where I come in," Jonathan replied. "I have resources, connections, and experience. If you're willing to take the leap, I'll guide you every step of the way." Latoya's mind raced with possibilities. She thought about the things she'd always dreamed of doing, but had written off as impossible. A catering business, a community center, maybe even a program to help others get back on their feet. The ideas felt distant, almost unreachable. But for the first time, they didn't seem entirely out of the question. Still, a part of her hesitated. "I don't want to feel like I owe you," she said, her tone cautious. "You won't," Jonathan assured her. "The only thing I ask is that you stay true to who you are. Use this gift to help others the same way you helped me." That's all. Latoya sat in silence for a long moment, her fingers tracing the edge of the check. She thought about the diner, about Mr. Harper's scorn, and the way he dismissed her compassion as weakness. She thought about the man sitting across from her, a stranger who had seen something in her that she struggled to see in herself. And she thought about her future, the one she'd always imagined but never dared to chase. Finally, she looked up at Jonathan, a spark of determination in her eyes. "Okay," she said, "let's do this." The days that followed felt like a whirlwind. Jonathan stayed true to his word, meeting with Latoya regularly to map out her dreams and turn them into a concrete plan. After countless conversations, brainstorming sessions, and a lot of encouragement, she decided on her path: a community cafe that would serve as both a business and a safe space for people in need. The cafe would offer affordable meals and host workshops for job seekers, financial literacy classes, and even community events. Latoya wanted it to be more than just a place to eat. She wanted it to be a beacon of hope for anyone who walked through the door. With Jonathan's financial backing and connections, things began to fall into place. They secured a space in a busy part of town. Not fancy, but big enough to house her vision. Contractors came in to renovate, and Latoya spent every spare moment planning menus, hiring staff, and spreading the word. When the grand opening day finally arrived, Latoya stood in the middle of the bustling cafe, overwhelmed by the turnout. The place was filled with people from all walks of life, neighbors, old friends, and even strangers who had heard about her story. The air buzzed with excitement and the aroma of freshly brewed coffee and pastries. Jonathan stood off to the side, a quiet smile on his face as he watched Latoya work the room. She moved with confidence, greeting each guest with the warmth and kindness that had always defined her. He knew she didn't need his guidance anymore. She was exactly where she was meant to be. Toward the end of the evening, Latoya took a moment to address the crowd, standing near the counter, her voice steady but filled with emotion. She shared her journey a year ago. "I was just a waitress at a diner." She began, her eyes scanning the room. "I thought that was all I'd ever be. But sometimes life surprises you. Sometimes a small act of kindness can lead to something bigger than you ever imagined." She paused, her gaze landing on Jonathan. "I learned that kindness isn't a weakness. It's a strength, and it has the power to change lives. Not just for the person receiving it, but for the person giving it." The room erupted into applause, and Latoya felt a surge of gratitude. She had doubted herself so many times, but now, standing in her cafe, surrounded by love and support, she knew she had made the right choice. As the night wound down, Jonathan approached her. "You've done something incredible here, Latoya," he said, his voice quiet but full of pride. "I couldn't have done it without you." She replied sincerely. He shook his head. You had it in you all along. I just gave you a little push." Latoya smiled, her heart full well. "Thank you for believing in me when I didn't believe in myself." Jonathan tipped his head in acknowledgement, then glanced around the bustling cafe. "You're going to help a lot of people here. I hope you realize that I do." Latoya said, her voice soft but resolute. "And I'm ready." The cafe became a cornerstone of the community, living up to Latoya's vision and then some. It wasn't just a place for meals. It was a place for second chances, for growth, and for connection. People came not only for the food, but for the sense of belonging they found within its walls. And for Latoya, it was proof that staying true to her values, kindness, compassion, and resilience, was the greatest gift she could give, both to herself and to others.